And so he was like, I don't think you want to go to Boston. And I was like, what do you mean? He's like, no, you don't want to do Boston. You're not going to like Boston. It's like, you should go to Tallahassee. I was like, what? What's in Tallahassee? Florida A&M University. And he, made a call. I flew down to meet the dean of the business school at Florida A&M. Told him my story. He was looking at my transcript. And I dropped out of college. I didn't finish classes. All my incompletes turned into Fs. I had a 1.9 GPA. And he was like, I am impressed with what you have accomplished so far in life. And literally gave me a dean's exception.
Welcome to Career Cheat Code. In this podcast, you'll hear how everyday people impact the world through their careers. Learn about their journey, career hacks, and obstacles along the way. Whether you're already having the impact you want or are searching for it, this is the podcast for you.
So, Greg, welcome to the show.
Radhy, what's up, man? Thanks for inviting me.
Appreciate you taking the time. You have been doing a lot of great work recently, so we'd love to hear more about that and some of the stuff that has led you to this point. But, let's dive right in, man. Let's tell the world what it is you do for a living.
So sometimes I wonder myself. No, I'm the executive director of the Social Justice Fund, which was founded by Clara Wu Tsai in 2020. And the Social Justice Fund was an initiative that she announced to invest $50 million in Brooklyn over 10 years. It was at the point in time when George Floyd was murdered, but Clara and her husband, Joe, about 6 months before, had just acquired the Brooklyn Nets and the New York Liberty. So it was also an opportunity for her to invest in Brooklyn around issues that she cares about. So economic mobility, racial justice, and the arts. And so I work with her specifically to help her execute her vision and also invest in organizations in Brooklyn.
That's awesome. So you find organizations that align with those pillars of work, typically nonprofit organizations, I'd imagine, and you help financially support, scale, replicate, pilot some of the work that they're already doing?
Yeah, so we're a little bit different. On the economic mobility front, we focus a lot on addressing access to capital, specifically for businesses in underserved communities. So what you'll find is that we're doing a lot of work in terms of providing capital access to for-profits, actually. So a good example is our Revitalize Brooklyn initiative, where businesses in the creative economy can actually receive $50,000 grant from us. One of the things that I do is really look for great partners to help build out these programs. So for example, I'm not the one sort of reviewing financials and making loans and grants, et cetera, et cetera. For some of the programs, we rely on institutions like community development financial institutions, CDFIs. And so, they sort of get a grant from us and then they use that capital to get it out to the community. So there's a number of initiatives around business support. Our goal is really to, sustain a lot of the businesses in Brooklyn, actually help create more jobs. So if these businesses are, still in business, they'll hire, et cetera, et cetera. But there is a part of, and that's 60-70% of the work that we do. The other, the remaining, 30-40% is actually exactly what you said. I find organizations that are aligned with Clara's priorities. I vet them. We look at different sort of the impact that those organizations have. I then sort of have meetings and, kick the tires on their programming. One of the main, there's a couple of things I look for. One, is it impactful? Is it scalable? Is it sustainable? And so is it innovative? And so using those sort of lens, I then make a determination on which organizations we should fund. And then I present it to Clara. And most of the times we, are in agreement. Sometimes she has an organization that she wants me to look at and vice versa. So it's a great partnership. It's similar to working for a foundation, your standard foundation that your listeners might be familiar with, like the Ford Foundation, Rockefeller Foundation, et cetera. They do similar work, but instead I work specifically for a family member.
Wow, that makes a lot of sense. And, that requires a lot of trust, right? For this person to trust you, your sound judgment, your advice as this person is seeking to have their legacy, their impact, right?
Yep.
On community.
That's one of the biggest difference between this job versus other jobs. It's definitely a personal connection. Clara and I started talking in 2020 about the work that she wanted to do. And we wanted to, and part of the conversation, and, there was multiple interviews, but part of the conversation was whether we were values aligned, and the things that she wanted to do are the things that, I cared about. And so, yes, there's a lot of trust involved. There's a lot of trust in terms of my connection to the community as well. I definitely need to be out there learning about, what organizations are doing great things. The good part of this and the great part of the job was that I had that experience. My previous work in the city of New York required me to be out in all 5 boroughs and work with actually the same organizations that I'm working with now to sort of make an impact in the community. So everything just worked out that my lived experience, my previous experience led me and made me, sort of like qualified for this job.
That makes sense. So, and we'll get to your city experience and kind of how some of that background came together. And that's, when our paths first crossed. Oh, yeah. Before we get there, because this sounds like a very, unique type of role. Like these roles are not a dime a dozen, right? Like they're not always available.
I don't think you're going to find this type of role on Indeed, to be honest with you.
Exactly. Right. So can you speak a little bit about, how you actually get connected to have these types of conversations and be considered for this type of role? And then also, like, what's your favorite part of your role?
Yeah, so I think, for your listeners, these types of roles are very, very limited. I think, one of the biggest questions I get from individuals is like, well, how did you get this job, et cetera, et cetera. And to be honest and actually transparent, my connection to Clara was based off of the individuals who I worked with previously with the city of New York. Individuals who, saw my approach to leadership, individuals who saw, my passion for community, individuals who saw my ability to execute. And so because of that, when Clara was, sort of doing her own listening tour and talking to individuals about what should be done in Brooklyn, one of the questions that she asked is like, who should I talk to? And those individuals were like, you should talk to Gregg. So one of the most important lessons for your viewership is, you want to have people that talk about you in rooms that you're not in, and not only talk about you, but talk about you positively. Right? Because, what you don't want is somebody to say like, no, not that person. Right.
Absolutely.
And so I feel very blessed and fortunate that I was able to make strong connections in my time in my previous role. And that led to this position. Now, there's not a lot of opportunities when, you have somebody who wants to give back to community, has significant means to do that, and wants to like hire a team. Like that's very rare. However, there are sort of like, jobs in this field in philanthropy that opens up once, every now and then. But it really is about your network in terms of like when those roles open up, you have to know about it. You have to get your resume in, et cetera, et cetera. So it is, the philanthropic industry is very, very, very insular, I say, because, everybody knows everyone. And because the work is so meaningful, the turnover is very, very low. And so when it happens, though, there's a huge disruption and, folks move, the chess pieces move, and then it calms down again.
That makes sense. And I've definitely seen that, it's kind of a revolving door, right? Like if you're able to do something good in philanthropy in one place, you can typically take your talents to another foundation. And as you said, people just find so much connection with the work that, they tend to stay in the field.
Yeah. And especially, for example, the work that I'm doing is with a family, right? And so there is a world where, that work ends and, the family recommends me to another family. You know what I mean? Like that's sort of like how that operates. Or you have, a small foundation or another, sort of individual that wants to start a foundation, and you have that expertise where you've worked with government, you've worked with the nonprofit sector, you've worked in the private sector, you worked with a family foundation. And so they want that type of experience. But as you can see, like the layers of experience that you need to have, which makes these jobs very, very, very competitive, but also, and when I say competitive, meaning experience-wise, and so there's a very limited few that have that type of experience. So that's why it seems like a revolving door. But certainly, in like, for example, in my case where, Clara, sort of one of the conversations we had was, she's not a philanthropist. And I was like, Clara, I'm not a philanthropist either. And she was like, great. So that way we can, do some innovative things. So sometimes you do get that breakthrough where in newer individuals, sort of step into the field and come with different different ideas.
No, absolutely. So that makes a lot of sense. In this type of unique role, I will say philanthropy, while it is insular, from my experience, right, just so viewers don't get discouraged and say, well, I have to know someone to get me in the door, right? I got my job at the Rockefeller Foundation applying on LinkedIn without knowing anyone there.
It was on LinkedIn and not like Indeed or something like that? Like,
correct.
But you were connected. Were you connected to someone that posted?
Not at all.
They posted on LinkedIn?
They did. So they posted a LinkedIn job and I just applied blindly without knowing a soul in that building.
Got it.
And, it worked out. But the reason why, though, absolutely, I think that's exactly, to your point, it's because they were seeking folks that worked specifically in economic development, had experience dealing with government directly, and had experience either building or supporting entrepreneurs, right? Like those are very layered, specific things. So it makes sense. But, I completely agree that you need the experience to back it, to be sure that you're like a subject matter expert in something that aligns with that foundation, or have that network to at least get you a conversation.
Yeah, absolutely. I have to stress about that network, right? That network is so important. And the other thing I want to make sure your listeners understand is like, depending on, your career trajectory, treat everyone with respect. I remember, when I was just starting my career, the receptionist, the custodian, everyone in the building, it was like, hey, how you doing? How's everything? You have a conversation, et cetera, because you never know, like that person could know someone in, sort of in their off time and say like, hey, I know, there's this guy that always says hello to me, blah, blah, blah. You just never know. Or that person could become your boss at some point in time. So
absolutely,
always treat people with respect.
Absolutely. And, and I'll get to that now, because that's kind of how you and I met each other, right? Like we met each other early on in our, at least in my career for sure. And at the time, you weren't, the head of a city agency or any of that. We were partnering together on a program to support entrepreneurs. We had to sit in the same classroom for like, a couple of weeks in a row, just in the back of the classroom, taking notes and doing things as like counterparts, basically doing it on behalf of the agency and supporting the work on that side. Me doing it at the time on behalf of Columbia University.
Yeah.
And we just stayed in touch and we just built a relationship from there, right? And, since then, I think that was remarkable, because not only have we built a friendship since then, you're also a mentor to me. You're someone that's on my board of directors, right? Like when I have a life decision to make, I'm calling Gregg.
I don't know if I'm taking all that credit.
No, I'm expressing. I've called you for basically every job opportunity I've received since, right? And said, hey, I don't know what I'm doing. I don't know what to think here. You've guided me to make sure that I negotiated better salary, better titles. Sometimes you've advised me not to take the roles. And then that's what I'm doing. I'm not taking that role. So Listen. I just appreciate it. And that came from just meeting people where they are and like just building from there.
So first of all, I appreciate that. I would say it's my pleasure. I would say, I have a guiding principle that, your success is my success, right? I don't think sometimes we operate with that in mind, because if you're successful, guess what? Like I benefit from that, right? Like even if it's, that steak dinner that you take me to, you know what I mean? Like your success certainly will help not only your family, but all of us, right? Sadiq Bello, I always talk about, he was, I guess, 24, 25 at the time, working at Vibe magazine. At the time, I was probably 17 or 18. And I had just, I was teaching myself how to code and was stealing pictures from Vibe. And they found out, meaning Sadiq, and he sent me a cease and desist email. But in the second paragraph was like, we kind of, like what you did with our stuff. Why don't you come in? And that's how I got my first start in terms of my career. But Sadiq Bello, he doesn't know this, but definitely was the person that shaped sort of who I am today. There was a number of other folks, right? But Sadiq talked about us as Black men not supporting each other. Sadiq talked about us as Black men undervaluing the skill set that we have. And therefore, if we get the first job offer, we're going to take the first salary, right? Because we are so sort of appreciative, right? The market is so tough for us in terms of getting the right job that when it happens, we don't want to like overplay our hand. We don't want to ask for too much. And so therefore we undervalue the skill that we have, right? It's easy, I understand, for me to say that, especially when you're employed, right? But that is definitely something we suffer with in terms of, as I think, a culture. And I think we're getting better, obviously, from the past decade or so. But we certainly can do more in terms of like demanding the salaries that we should be earning. And so I'll always remember those conversations, the teenage me, the young adult me. And so, even after when I left Vibe, I started practicing sort of like what City put in me in terms of like, you have a skill. I always remember that in my head. You have a skill that someone wants. What is the value of that skill, right? And you determine that value, right? Because if somebody's offering you to pay you $80,000 and you're looking to make $150,000, at some point in time, if you accept that $80,000, then you have devalued yourself, right? It is not on them, right? They're a business, they're a corporation, they're looking to, especially, with labor costs, they're looking to reduce and keep the labor costs as low as possible. But they also know that you have the skill set that they're looking for. So I remember those conversations. And the other thing that I practice is like, pay it forward. So that is why, like, you and I, connected. I would tell you the same thing that Sadiq told me. And I continue to do that to this day, because I think, I always joke around with, all the folks who, I have conversations with and mentors that, when you make it, I just want to have the first ride on your private jet. That's all. That's all I want. You know what I mean? Just remember me.
That's awesome. For sure. So, let's talk a little bit about kind of what led you to that introduction to Sadiq. So tell me more about, where'd you grow up?
Oh, man.
And when you were around 17.
Yeah.
When you were around that age of 17, 18 years old, like, what'd you think you were going to be at that age?
Oh, man.
And how'd that come together?
That's a great question, because contrary to popular opinion, I didn't have a plan. And, and we talked about this. I'm at the point in my career where, folks are like, oh, wow, like, look at his resume. He's done this, he's done that, he's done this, he's done that. He must have like been structured. The only thing that was structured about me was that I felt like, okay, something will happen. Like, I don't know what, but something's going to happen. I do give credit. Obviously, I grew up in a single family household. My mom worked really, really, really hard. She worked actually 2 jobs to send me to private school. So let's start there. I had a strong foundation with the resources necessary for me to get into the best high school. And yes, Brooklyn Tech is the best high school. I don't care what they say out there, but I went to Brooklyn Tech. And that afforded me the exposure to things like robotics and programming, et cetera, et cetera. I was a mechanical engineer. I never played basketball. And I love saying that. I'm 6'6". And when people come in, it's like, hey, did you play ball? You must have played ball. No. I'm a nerd, right? Like I'm a mechanical engineer. And then when I say I'm a mechanical engineer, they're like, oh, right? They're like, yes. You know what I mean? T-square, like, all that kind of stuff. And so I was able to have the exposure and develop the curiosity in terms of like what this programming thing was and this language. And so when I ended up, but I didn't have a plan. Like I only applied to one college, chalk that up to the fact that my mom, didn't understand the college system here. I went on, I think, one college tour, and that's the only college I applied to. They rejected me. I thought the world was going to end. I ended up in New York City Tech. So shout out to CUNY for being sort of like like CUNY is like literally, when the safety net, right? It's like when all else fails, you've got CUNY, right? And for me, like, I thought everything was failing. Went into New York City Tech, transferred to Brooklyn College, and that is where I got exposed to Unix systems and this thing called Netscape and this thing called the web. And that's when I started being more curious about programming, like I said, taught myself how to code. And again, I'm saying this like casually, but remember, like I'm living in East Flatbush, right? I have to convince my mom to like get me a computer. A computer at that time was like almost like, I don't know, it's like $2,000 or something like that. And back then, that's a lot of money, right? And so the fact that my mom had the ability to do that and provide for me, that's why I give her a lot of props, right? And so because there are a lot of folks out there that have like this burning, skill, but they don't have the means to get the equipment to actually start doing the work, right? And so it's all about opportunity and access. And I'll talk a little bit about that, hopefully throughout the rest of this conversation. And so that's what started me, man. I started working at Vibe, but like I said, I dropped out of college because, I was that .com kid. And I'm like, hey, it was a big deal at home. My mom was like, you're not staying here. No, she didn't kick me out, but she was very upset about the fact that I dropped out of college. But I worked for 7.5 years in tech without a college degree. And I tell that story because I want folks to know that not everyone is going to follow that linear path of like high school, college, grad school, work, right? Sometimes people have like a different way of getting to the end goal. And in this case, I had a skill though, right? So if you decide like, okay, college not for you, make sure you have a skill and a skill that's in demand. Because at the time I was able to command salaries, $50,000, $90,000. I topped off at $125,000, right? At 25, right? And so, that's because I had a skill set. And that's because I poured a lot of energy in developing that skill on my own. And so there's a level of, there's a certain level of, sort of hard work, and, we talk about that with this generation, but certainly like, you do have to put in the time and the effort. And then September 11th happened and what we call the .com crash. So I know like, Gen Z, they've gone through like a whole bunch of life-changing things. For me, I think the first major life-changing thing was September 11th. The fact that I was unemployed. This was 2001 into 2002. I was unemployed for almost a whole year. Self-doubt, depression, there's so many things that came up during that time. And I had no idea what I was going to do, because remember, I built up a huge tech resume. I was like a vice president. I was a director. And now I was facing that glass ceiling of the only roles I could apply for would be senior management roles, but they require a degree. And I didn't have a degree. And so my uncle and I were having a conversation and he was like, look, Greg, you're a Black man without a degree. What do you think your future is going to be? And I was like, but I have a car, I have an apartment, like I have a mortgage. Like I was 25 with a mortgage, you know what I mean? It's like, I can't go back to school now. I haven't been in math class since like 1993. Like, what are you talking about? You know what I mean? But I spoke to a couple of my mentors, Keith Klingscales. That's another name that I want to make sure I give credit to. He was the CEO of Vibe when I was working there, and I went back to him. He had gone to this school, in Boston called Harvard and got his master's. And so here I am. I was like, hey, Keith, I need you to make a couple calls and get me into Harvard. So again, another gem, a closed mouth don't get fed, right? You've got to speak things into existence. And so I am definitely one, like if I want to, like, what they say, shoot for the moon, right? And hit the stars. So I was shooting for Saturn, like forget the moon, like I'm getting to Saturn, right? And so he was like, I don't think you want to go to Boston. And I was like, what do you mean? He's like, no, you don't want to do Boston. You're not going to like Boston. It's like, you should go to Tallahassee. I was like, what? What's in Tallahassee? Florida A&M University. And he, made a call. I flew down to meet the dean of the business school at Florida A&M. Told him my story. He was looking at my transcript. And I dropped out of college. I didn't finish classes. All my incompletes turned into Fs. I had a 1.9 GPA. And he was like, I am impressed with what you have accomplished so far in life. And literally gave me a dean's exception. I applied to other colleges because I didn't make the same mistake. Morehouse was the other college that accepted me. Everybody else said, go to a community college. And I chose FAMU not only because of Keith, but also, the cost of living in Tallahassee was much cheaper than Atlanta. But that was the best decision ever. And so I love HBCUs. So a lot of the passion you see me bring to the work I do, even when I was with the city, around understanding folks who are unemployed, I've been through it, right? Understanding how to train people in skills that are in demand so they can earn a decent living, I've been through it, right? Supporting HBCUs, right? I understand the importance of that, right? And so the Greg that you see today is sort of shaped by, it's almost like, how the Grand Canyon was shaped by the wind and the water and all that. Like, that's me, right? Like, life's failures shaped who you see today. And that resume is based off of, like, it's like an iceberg, right? If you go underneath, you'll see everything that I just talked about in terms of the times where I thought, I have no idea what I'm going to be doing.
Wow. Wow. No, and I appreciate you sharing that, right? Because I do think it's easy to look at you and say, he's so successful. He probably always had it figured out. He probably always had a roadmap. And then they hear, oh, actually, I dropped out of school with my 1.9 GPA, worked for 7 years, and then got convinced to move out of New York and go to
Tallahassee, Florida, right?
Like, to be a student, right?
The culture shock, bro. So let me tell you a sidebar. Growing up in New York, right? You think going down south is Virginia. Like, I kid you not. Like, when I tell you, like, you tell people I'm going down south, we're talking about Virginia, right? I was in Tallahassee, Florida, which is like South Georgia. The first thing is, people, when they hear Florida, they always think Miami, right? So Tallahassee, Florida has no beaches. It's all like, sort of like, it's like redwoods or whatever, like these big trees, the big oak trees that, if they could talk, probably would say, like, I had, dead black bodies on me, hanging on me in the, early 1800s, whatever. Confederate flags, you know what I mean? Like, this is the part of Florida, the Panhandle, where you are quickly reminded about who you are in terms of your skin color. And certainly me coming from New York as a Yankee, you know what I mean? It was a huge culture shock. But guess what? Like, the campus of Florida A&M was like a safety zone. You know what I mean? It was just like the culture, the teachers. My graduation, so I graduated when I was 30. I went back to school at 27, which is a whole hilarious episode in itself, because I was very determined, right? Like, I was that student who, like, I'm paying my own tuition. So I need to make sure that I get every single cent out of this class. And so if the class ends at 9:50, at 9:45, I don't understand what you just said, right? Like, everybody wants to go. I'm seated, like, I don't get it. Like, you need to finish up and give me my last 5 minutes, right? But FAMU, when I tell you, the teachers, their investments in terms of, like, pouring into you to make sure that you're successful, because they understand most of the population of FAMU. It's like, maybe it's about 60% Black, maybe a little bit more. But, some are first generation students, some are legacy, but they understand, like, okay, you may not be able to afford, to pay for your tuition for 4 years. So it's going to take you 5 years. It may take you 6 years because you have to get a job. You know what I mean? Or you have, like, childcare duties. You have, like, a whole bunch of, like, the faculty. It's, there's the slogan they call caring with excellence, but the faculty cares so much about your success that when I graduated, I was walking across that stage. I was 30. And I remember the first, it was a dean. Oh my gosh, I just blanked on her name. But when I saw her, she was the first person that welcomed me on campus. And when I saw her on stage, she gave me the biggest hug, like a mom would do, and said, I'm so proud of you. And Radhy, that was it. My eyes, my graduation picture, my eyes are bloodshot red because I was bawling. It was just like, because you don't understand, like, the lesson out of all of this is that I was afraid to go back to school, right? And fear will always be the enemy to success, right? And a lot of people fear to do X, right? And sometimes you just have to do it, right? You have to take that leap of faith. And there were many times, right? Just remember, like, I was making, over $100,000. Here I am in Tallahassee, Florida, at, Tallahassee Mall, at a Gap with my resume, looking for a job. You know what I mean? They're confused, right? Because they're seeing, like, director of this, VP of that, and they're like, you're looking for what? Like a sales job? I was like, look, ignore the resume. I just need money, right? I need to, like, right. You know what I mean? But, my church family came through. And, I lead at least I hope I lead a balanced life. And so my church family sometimes would send me a check for like $100, $200, hey, God just laid it on my heart to send you some money. And so that leap of faith and, the support of my network, my family, was what got me through college.
I love that. And, I think part of it is, as you mentioned, right, not just the fear, right, but the lack of faith that the universe will conspire to help you,
Yeah.
right? Like you took this faith and someone connected you to a dean of the business school. You took this leap of faith and some of the folks in your church were like, let me support you.
Yep.
The dean gave you a big hug when you got there because this person saw your struggles and understood what you went through to get there, right? And I think the universe really comes together to make sure that we succeed in what we set our minds to.
Absolutely. Valencia Matthews is her name. She was the
Wow.
dean of the school. I think it's like theater, School of Performing Arts, I think it is. But let me tell you this. So the thing about, these leap of faiths, sometimes, and I talk about opportunity. Now, remember, Keith was one that opened up the door, right?
Mm-hmm.
I had to step through it, right? And I had to perform. And so, I also want to make sure on the record, like when I graduated from FAMU, I had a 3.7 GPA, right? Like, it's no joke, you know what I'm saying? But when I got there, one of the things I stepped into the School of Journalism, because one of my good friends, he went to Georgia Tech and he had a radio show in Atlanta on WREK Atlanta. And I sometimes when I went to visit him, I would go on the show. I was like, oh, this is cool. And so FAMU also has a radio station called WANM 90.5. And I was like, oh, well, I could go in there and like maybe get a radio show just like my friend, right? And when I went in there was this guy called, his name is Keith Miles. There are a lot of Keiths in my life. And so Keith, he talks about the story about this kid. Now, remind you, I'm 27, but he calls me a kid. This kid that kept on coming in to the station asking about opportunities. And that was me. I kept on going in. It's like, hey, is there anything I could do? And like I was willing to volunteer because I had nothing else to do. Like I went from a full work schedule to school schedule, which is very different, right? It's like Monday, Wednesday, Friday is class. What am I supposed to do Tuesday and Thursday? Like,
Right.
I have all this time. Like, what am I supposed to do? And the New Yorker in me is like, I can't waste time. I got to occupy that time with something. And so I ended up volunteering at the college radio station, which a semester later turned into an offer to be the news director, which is how I ended up getting a job. And then right after that semester, I became the program manager of the station. So not only I was the program manager for the station for almost 3 years, then I became the operations manager once I graduated, which is like a full-time job. So a lot of people don't know that I have a radio background. A lot of people don't know that like I'm the voice of WANM in Tallahassee. So if you go to Tallahassee, Florida, and at the top hour of every hour, and you're listening to WANM, you'll hear me give you the ID.
That's great. I'm gonna have to test that theory and
we're in a situation. Actually, you don't even need to go to Tallahassee, Florida. You can just like pull up WANM on the web and stream it. It's college radio. It's good. It's actually good music, student program. But that's how I ended up with almost a minor in journalism. Wow. And even today, Florida A&M produces the most Black journalists. And one of the things that I'm passionate about, I'm on the board of visitors for the School of Journalism, is how do we get more of our voices out there to tell our story.
So when you took this job upon graduation, right, you didn't go down there with the intentions to work at a radio station, right?
No.
So you take this job, but in your mind, did you have an idea of what you wanted to do? Because that's also a big shift from working in tech to now working at a radio station, but you went down there for business. So where was your mindset?
So this is the part that I'm telling you, like I did not have a plan. So let's talk about the fact that the goal for me was to graduate, right? And so that's what kept me focused, right? It wasn't sort of like, okay, I need to have a degree in this, et cetera, et cetera. My goal was to have a diploma that says that now I could show to the world that, okay, this person can learn, right? This person is teachable. And that's really what the paper tells like industry, right? It's like you have structured, you know how to like perform under pressure, like literally a whole bunch of, it's sort of like understanding of your personality comes through your diploma. When I graduated, and we go through this every decade. Every decade, I think everyone changes, right? You have sort of like this crisis of like this identity crisis of like, what am I doing and what do I want to do, right? And so when I graduated, I was like, okay, I knew for sure I did not want to go back into tech. I did not know where I wanted to go, but my resume was leading me into tech. And so I remember a recruiter from the New York Times came up to campus and he saw my resume. You know, these recruiters, they're used to college resumes. And he saw my resume. He's like, oh, wait a minute. I need to put you in a different pile, right? And then I had like the CTO of the New York Times call me and he was like, yeah, you know, you have an interesting resume, you know, and this was their space in Tampa. And there was a thought of me actually ending up in Tampa working for the New York Times. There was a thought of me just staying in Tallahassee and working at the university. But my network, and because I, sent my emails to a lot of folks, the next name that I'm going to mention in terms of who have been instrumental in my life, Barbara Chang. And so again, and I wanted to make sure your viewers understand like how to connect the dots. So when I was at thestreet.com, one of the early investors of thestreet.com was Flatiron Partners, right? That's Fred Wilson, who's a venture capitalist, and Jerry Colonna. I reached out to Fred and Jerry looking for opportunities. And this is when I was laid off in 2001. And Jerry connected me to his wife at the time, Barbara Chang. Barbara Chang ran a nonprofit called Empower. And so I consulted with Empower for like 3 months and then basically went to Barbara. Actually, she hired me. This is a funny story. She hired me in October of 2002. I'll never forget that. And I told her like, hey, I made a decision to go back to school. So I'm leaving in January. And she's like, okay, it's fine. Like she needed me to do some work. December came and I went into her office and I said, hey, so next week is my last day. And she stopped, she was like tapping it. She stopped and was like, oh, you were serious? She was like, why are you going to Florida? There's plenty of schools in New York. But I was committed. So fast forward, I'm now graduating with my master's from Florida State, ready to figure out where I'm going to go. And I sent a note to Barb and said, hey, I'm looking for an opportunity. Let me know if if you hear of anything. This is what you typically use your network for. And she said, I actually need someone here. Right. And so believe it or not, that's how I got back to New York, worked at Empower to rebuild their workforce program. And again, their workforce program to do what? Train young people at Promise tech skills. So these are young people who are, came to Empower of the alternatives to incarceration, potentially homeless, et cetera, et cetera. And we were training them in tech skills to then find them meaningful work, which is my lived experience. And so at the gala, literally, I'm talking about, growing the program from like 40 students to 120 students. And someone from the Bloomberg administration is in the audience and approaches me during one of the sessions, one of the breaks, and says, have you ever thought about working for the city of New York? And I said, absolutely not. But I need the city to help me place these young people into jobs because I'm struggling finding jobs. And so she said, I could help. And she brought me into this agency called Small Business Services and talked about, the workforce system and how workforce could help the students. But then she said, but I want to talk to you about the Minority and Women Business Enterprise Program. And she was talking about, Mayor Bloomberg wants to like restart the program and she's looking for someone to help her. And literally after about maybe 3 or 4 conversations, I realized she was interviewing me. And then the final conversation was that I'm going to introduce you to the commissioner, but if he offers you a job, you have to tell me you're going to say yes. And so that's how I got connected to the city of New York. There was no plan for me ever to work for the city of New York. A matter of fact, and your listeners might appreciate this, government was an abstract thought for me. Like government was this thing where like there's politicians, there's the DMV, there's a police department, the sanitation department, but I don't, I'm not really, I don't know what this thing called government is, right? And so the fact that I was joining the Bloomberg administration, which was interesting, was supposed to be his last year and in his last term. And people asked me that question, like, why would you want to join administration at the end? And it's like, I didn't know anything about that. All I know is that my resume needs a big name and the city of New York is the biggest name I know, right? And even if I have the city of New York on my resume for 1 year, at least I could get a better job after that, right? That was my thinking, right? 1 year turned into 5, turned into 10, and then turned into 13. And wow. So it has been a magical ride. And I think I say magical because the work that I was doing was right in my alley. It was addressing economic mobility for communities that I'm really, really connected to. And also, just being in the room to talk through policy and being able to bring your lived experience to that, right? So there are many different times when, I would, talk about, okay, if we're going to help, small businesses in Canarsie, it can't be online. How many of those businesses have like online access, right? Like those are the type of conversations that I would have. So anyway, so that's basically how I got connected after college into the career that I had. And of course, starting with our earlier conversation, I did 13 years with the city of New York. And then that's how that got me connected to this job that I have right now. So now the complete sort of like infinity stone connection.
I love it. So what was your first role at the Department of Small Business Services, right? And then what was ultimately your last role? Because in 13 years, you grew a lot in your time there.
Yeah, and I stayed with, I think it's possible. The uniform agencies that this happens, I stayed in one agency. So many people with the experience that I have, usually bounce around from agency to agency, which is actually one of the benefits of government because you sort of like have different responsibilities and the work is different and it remains exciting. It doesn't get stale. But I stayed with one agency, but the work still remained exciting and didn't get stale because the agency is responsible for not only helping businesses, but helping New Yorkers with finding jobs and also supporting and strengthening commercial corridors. So I had to deal with everything from minority and women-owned businesses, Hurricane Sandy, steam pipe explosions, terrorist attacks, opening up workforce centers. Like there were so many different things that I had to do in this job that it just every day was always something exciting. I started as an assistant commissioner. And, for those who are in government that's listening, they would say like, oh, wow, that's like a huge title. I had no idea what assistant commissioner was. like all I know was, I was at NPower. I was a director, a senior manager of workforce development. They were asking me like, okay, what's the equivalent of that title? Because you're coming into assistant commissioner. I was like, I don't know, but I started as assistant commissioner, which once I got into government, I realized how blessed I was to actually come into government at that level and that rank. And then, about 2, I think maybe 3 years later, I got promoted by Commissioner Rob Walsh, who hired me to deputy commissioner. And so my portfolio expanded. And then I went through sort of the transition from the Bloomberg administration to the de Blasio administration. I was asked by the incoming commissioner, Maria Torres Springer, to stay on, which is, a blessing as well. And I stayed as a deputy commissioner under her leadership. And then when she was moved to become the president of EDC, that is when I went to the mayor. And it wasn't sort of like it was one of those situations. Again, a closed mouth don't get fed. I was 7 years in at SBS, and I went through one transition. And when Maria left, I was like, okay, if I cannot sit in this commissioner seat, then why am I here, right? And so I was at Gracie Mansion at an event, invited not by the mayor, but by someone else, a close friend, who is actually the same close friend that connected me to Clara. And the mayor came to our table, and I stood up, and I said, hi, Mr. Mayor, my name is Gregg Bishop. He's like, I know who you are, Greg, with 2 G's. And the minute he said 2 G's, I was like, oh, he does know who I am, right? And I was like, I'd like to talk to you about SBS, and I want you to consider me being the commissioner. And he was like, oh, you want to figure out like, I'd love to hear your ideas, et cetera, et cetera. And so I had to verbally, say, I want this role. I didn't, was going to sit back and wait for somebody to come to me. And, so there is a level when we talk about career growth, like you have to, a door can open, but you got to step through, right? And not only step through, but step through with confidence. Step through, sometimes you have to step through a little bit aggressively. And my aggressive behavior was like approaching the mayor at an event, right? And then, but I knew that was not the right time to start spewing my ideas, right? He would not be, he's distracted, et cetera. So what did I do? I asked him for his contact information. And then, Radhy, that night, like right after the event, I probably stayed up until like 3 a.m., right? I composed the most, and now I'm, everybody has ChatGPT, right? Like I could have done that in like 30 seconds, right? But I had to compose the most articulate email ever that sort of states who I am, what I want to do, and why I want to be considered. I sent it to a couple friends to like wordsmith for me to make sure like my grammar was correct. Like that was the most consequential email that I ever sent, I think. And one of the things that was driving me was I had to strike while the iron was hot. And so I did not want to wait a day or two to email him because he would forget. I wanted to email him immediately. So around 3 a.m., I fired off the email to him. And then, of course, went through the process, spoke to, the deputy mayor, et cetera, et cetera. And then in November of 2015, he gave me the call that I was waiting for. And I will tell you, sometimes you ask for something, but when it happens, then the weight is on your shoulders. And you're like, oh, this really is happening. Right? And I remember him calling me, I think it was the Friday. No, sorry. It was the Wednesday or either the Tuesday or Wednesday before Thanksgiving. And he offered me the job and said, now, you cannot say a word about this until Monday because that's when the press release is going to go out. And so, at Thanksgiving, everybody's like, so how's work? And you're like, well, but I will admit, I did tell one person, which was my mom. Like, I had to tell her,
Absolutely.
It's a big deal. But that's basically how I got to the point of being commissioner. And it was a lot more, right? Like a lot of folks, like my time at SBS as assistant commissioner, deputy commissioner, I was always in the community, talking to so many different stakeholders. Sometimes when I couldn't deliver to a stakeholder, I would actually tell them, look, I can't do it this time. So there's that respect of communication, sort of like delivering to different communities, being present in different communities. And so when the vetting started happening and folks at City Hall was like, okay, should Gregg be, I'm sure they spoke to stakeholders who were like, oh yeah, we know Gregg. We like Gregg. You know what I mean? And so it made it easier for the mayor and others to actually put me in that position.
So many cheat codes dropped right there. I
unloaded on you today, right?
I think that's great, right? Because if you think about it, like the closed mouths don't get fed for sure. Like you had the gall to go up to the mayor of New York City and say, hey, that job opening you have, you should consider me for that, right?
Exactly.
And granted, he was at that point 2 people removed from your role, right? So it wasn't like such a leap,
right?
But you approached him not knowing if he knew your name, right? So that says a lot, right? Then the follow up, just the prep time that it took to write a very thorough explanation as to why you think you should be considered for this, which is basically your cover letter, right? But in real time, and thinking about doing the same night. Like, even if it's 3 a.m, let me do it today because this is the mayor of New York. Tomorrow could be a fire in another borough and he'll forget about it.
Believe it or not, that night, a police officer got shot, right? Wow. And so to your point, there was a lot of distractions, right? And so that's why sometimes you have to strike while the iron is hot.
Absolutely. And just even before that, leading up to that, having a track record of delivering, right? So you got to SBS for 7 years, you've been delivering and you got promoted one time and you have this reputation both in community and within the building that you get invited to places like this to even have that proximity, right? So, and so that when they then go back and say, all right, what's up with this Gregg guy? The background check clears and people are like, nah, he's legit.
Exactly. So and that sort of like background check happened with this job. I guarantee you, Clara talked to more than just one person. And so your reputation, right? People talk about, reputation and reputation risk, et cetera, but you have to protect it fiercely. And so, for your listeners, the things that you do on social media, the things that you do at work, you know what I mean? Like you have to be at a point where people will talk about you positively behind closed doors. And some of it is just your work ethic. You know what I mean? Like, I am definitely, the analog to digital generation. I recognize where I am right now in sort of like the ecosystem of generations. I strongly will go back to doors open when you work hard. Right. And you don't have to give up like your personal time. You could have a good work-life balance, but you've got to deliver. Right. Things just don't come to you because you are John or Gregg or whatever. Right. Like you've got to like get your hands dirty. those are some of the things that I tell, my mentees now, right? Like, especially those that are coming into their career early on, like, you got to get your hands dirty, and you got to, like, sometimes you might have to stay a little bit after work, till 6, 7, 8 o'clock, right? But if someone gives you an assignment and you deliver on time or even early, they'll remember that, right? And if you are consistent in doing that, that's when opportunities come in terms of promotion, et cetera, et cetera.
One of the things I'd like to highlight here is that in different sectors, right? Because this is one of the things that actually led me to starting the show, was that you can make money in government, right?
Yeah.
So can you talk about, if you remember, you're like, how much money can someone make in a place like the Small Business Services or other city agencies, right? As you think about your start and your ending as like the head of it.
So the funny thing is, and this goes back to our salary conversation, right? I had to make some critical decisions in terms of like earning, right? And if you remember, I started this conversation telling you that I, at 25 was making $125,000. Fast forward, I have my master's degree. And when I went back to New York to work at Empower, I was making $90,000. So you're going to say, and your listeners going to be saying like, wait, he has a master's degree and he's making less, right? The reason why I took that job, two things. One, it got me back to New York, right? It was Barbara Chang, right? And it was a nonprofit. So I knew like, when the city came and knocking, right? The assistant commissioner position was paying $118,000. That's still less than what I was making prior to going back to school. So you will probably say, well, why did you take that job? Right? I told you why I took that job. It wasn't because of the salary. It was because of the brand, the city of New York on my resume. That was my thinking, was that, okay, I'm going to make this short-term sacrifice in terms of salary because I know at some point in time I'm going to be able to flip that into something larger because I have the city of New York on my resume. Now, it just happened that while I was in the city and, sort of working, that the increases happened. So once I became a deputy commissioner, that's when I sort of started seeing the value of like, having a degree, et cetera, et cetera. So deputy commissioners at SBS, I think they're much higher now, but at the time I was, I moved up to 130, then 150. And then I think deputy commissioners now at like 180 potentially. And then of course, when I became commissioner, the interesting thing about government is that at the commissioner level, we all make the same amount of money. Right. So whether you're the commissioner of the police department or SBS, we're at 235, or it's probably a little bit more now, but like it's, 235. And so leaving government, right. Philanthropy is a little bit trickier because now you're in the private sector. But I would say that every foundation, et cetera, it's such a wide range depending on what you want to do. So it could start at like 250 and you could end up, at 1.5 million. Right. It all depends on the size of the foundation. It all depends on the scope, the reach, the endowment. So philanthropy is a little bit different. But, I would say that the balance between, sort of like the work-life balance, the things that you're doing, the meaningful work that you're doing without the bureaucracy, like that certainly is a bonus for me. You know what I mean? And so that's sort of like that salary trajectory. So if you think of it like on a curve, like there was a high point in my 20s, then I sort of like dipped a little bit and then went up a little bit. And then sort of like, then it's almost like like a 5-year stock chart, right? Like it went up and then now it's like, it is right.
Absolutely. and that's super helpful, right? And I think as we think about not just salaries, but now you also have like a city pension behind you, right?
Oh,
like
yeah.
So many other things that make sense, right?
Wait. Here's the big thing. I got my loans forgiven. So that was 10 years in the public service. So that public service loan forgiveness program. Thank you to the Biden administration for changing some of the eligibility criteria. So that made me eligible in terms of the amount of payments that I made. But my gamble on paying for grad school, which a lot of people don't really need to, paid off because I was able to get my loans forgiven.
See, that's great. So loan forgiveness, pension, higher salary ultimately, and it led you on this trajectory of pivoting from doing tech to now doing community-driven work for entrepreneurs, and now ultimately to where you are now with the foundation. Were there any programs or resources along the way that helped you that you think people should check out?
Yeah, I think, let's talk about if you have young children. I definitely am a big fan of junior achievement. I think that sort of helped me understand sort of financial literacy, how, the private sector works, et cetera, et cetera. If you are young in your career, there are a number of programs that I attended. Coro Leadership New York, for example, was a professional development program that I attended. Great networking, not only great networking, but it also allowed you to explore different sectors and challenges in those sectors and actually interact with different individuals and personalities, but figure out a common language to solve that potential issue. I also, if you are mid-level to senior, the Harvard Kennedy School has a senior leaders in government. At the time, I think they also have a similar version for those not in government. But those programs were very, very helpful for me. When I did the Harvard program, I remember coming back and I remember one of the modules that we had. I can't remember everything, but I do remember this. One of the modules we talked about, I can't remember what it was, but this idea of disappointing people at a rate they can absorb. I came back with that. And that was, of all the things that we talked about, it's instantly remembered that and realized, oh, wait a minute, this is part of government, right? Like we can't say yes to everyone, but we have to be able to soften the blow when we say no, right? And so that I've used in my career ever since.
Are there any forms of media, books, movies, shows, podcasts that you have consumed that have helped you personally or professionally?
So Who Moved My Cheese is one of my favorite books because it talks about that fear of change. And I remember when I became commissioner, I had all my leadership team read Who Moved My Cheese because it's like, I wanted them to also understand, how their sort of internal safeguards sort of shows up in the workplace. Everybody has different levels of risk. And so Who Moved My Cheese is one of them. There was, oh my gosh, how am I blanking on his name now? The book is called Winning, though. Jack Welch. One of the things that he talked about was making a decision. The decision was a bad decision. And I think he had basically a plant blew up, right? Like a plant caught on fire based on the decision that he made. Because I think he was like storing chemicals or whatever. And what did I get out from that? Like, no matter how bad you think things are, like, just remember you didn't blow up a plant, right? So sometimes you have those days where you think like, oh my gosh, like work is so stressful. This is like and I remember sometimes I was like, well, I didn't blow up a plant. I'll figure it out. Right. So, yeah. So those are the two things that come off the top of my head. In terms of podcasts, I don't have like a favorite podcast. Like well, now I do.
You do now.
I was going to say now I do. Right. But I do think that, any type of program that allows, these type of conversations where you can learn gems from individuals, like, I don't have enough time to meet with everyone, right? And so sometimes even someone looking at this might be the thing that they need to figure out the next step, right? Instead of trying to get on my calendar, et cetera, et cetera. So I certainly would encourage folks, to seek out podcasts that deal with self-improvement and career development.
Gregg, in your career, which has gone from working at a magazine to running a radio show to ultimately reporting to the mayor and having hundreds of people reporting up to you, to now working at a family foundation, what are you most proud of in your career to this date?
Oh, wow. Well, let me start with the most recent. We created a loan fund to help businesses after the pandemic. 4 out of 5 businesses that received a loan from us are still in business, 5 years later. So super, super proud of that. 70% of those businesses were run by Black women. 40% of those businesses hired additional staff. I could go back to now SBS, and there's such a long list of things that I'm proud of. But the biggest thing that I'm proud of is actually building a great team at SBS. The team that we had when I was commissioner was, I think, one of the best. It reflected the diversity of the city. We did some amazing things. We had to deal with COVID. We had to deal, like I said, with the steam pipe explosions and terror attacks. But we also built out certain initiatives. Super, super proud of the fact that I was able to launch the NYC. It was an initiative specifically for Black entrepreneurs. And when I say super proud, even this administration continues to sort of like talk about the work around supporting Black entrepreneurs. And that was the intention that I had. I had a hand in the NYC, Women Entrepreneurs. I did some work with the Tenant Museum to highlight the contributions, the huge contributions of immigrant entrepreneurs. 50, I think it's 51 or 52% of businesses in New York City are owned by a foreign-born individuals. The list, as you can see, the list goes down in terms of like the things that I feel super, super proud of. We built workforce centers I opened up a workforce center in Far Rockaway. Thinking about, for those who don't understand city geography, Far Rockaway is called Far Rockaway for a reason, right? It's far, right? In order to get to like the nearest workforce center in Jamaica, you have to jump on a train. I think it's like an hour or 2 hour ride. You know what I mean? And so why should individuals lose out on opportunities simply because they live in a certain zip code? We were able to open up a center there, which the community really appreciated. So there's a number of things, a long list of things that I was. That's why my time working in the city from the different levels, it will always be the pinnacle of giving back to communities that I care about. I don't think I'm ever going to have an opportunity to have that impact that I had. This current job is terrific. We focus on Brooklyn, right? With the city, I'm in Staten Island. I'm in the Bronx, right? Like I know so much about the Bronx in terms of like the challenges, et cetera, et cetera. You know what I mean? Like my Staten Island IQ went up really quick, right? It's like North Shore. Okay, all right. Right. Okay, right. Like the South Shore is like, yeah, okay, I got you. You got, okay, right. Arthur Avenue, right? Okay, I got you, right? You know what I mean? Like, learning all about, Queens and the diversity of Queens and, all that stuff. Like, I would always be appreciative of the time that I had with the city.
Is there anything else we haven't discussed today that the world should know about Gregg? Gregg with 2 G's, that
right,
is.
Right, Gregg with 2 G's who, I think live every single day to the fullest. And I know that sounds cliche, but like 3 years ago, I actually had 2 blood clots. So I started my fitness journey, was really struggling in the gym. My trainer was like, breathe, you're not breathing. I was like, I am. Like, I'm trying to breathe. And literally, Naeem, Naeem Barnaby is my angel, right? He's my guardian angel. I literally was working out with him in January. I think it's now, 25, maybe 22 or something like that. And couldn't even warm up. And he's like, okay, I know you went to the virtual ER, but you got to go to a real ER. Something is wrong with you. You need to stop playing, right? Like he's Jamaican. So, it's that sort of like, you need to go now, right? and Radhy, I went, they did a whole bunch of tests, et cetera, et cetera. And 2 doctors popped up on my bed. And I remember I was planning, I'm part of a fraternity called Alpha Phi Alpha Fraternity Incorporated. Shout out to all the bros. And we were having a gala that Saturday. And this is like a Wednesday. And we're planning to have the general president. And I'm coordinating like who's going to pick up the general president, et cetera. And the curtain opens up and it's 2 doctors. And they're like, so we have some images and we don't like what we see. So we're going to need to keep you for observation. And we're going to need to put you on this and blah, blah. And so like I'm hearing them speak, but all I heard was keep, right? And so my first response was like, so I can't leave? You know what I mean? I've never been hospitalized before. And so they found 2 blood clots in my lungs. And those clots were probably in my lungs for at least, a month or 2. And so, I had to go on immediate blood thinners for a year, almost 2 years. I was on blood thinners similar to like Chris Bosh. Thank God now that I only need to take the thinners when I travel. But, it hit me that at any given moment, I could have died immediately, like instantly. And so I have a renewed passion for life and just, this journey that we're on. And certainly I know there's individuals who are on the journey. You get to a certain age where you realize you're mortal, right? I think for your listeners, every day you need to live as if it might be your last. I know this sounds like a little bit morbid, but I think, you can really do a lot if, imagine if somebody told you that you only have 6 days to live, right? You would do so much. And remember that fear that I talk about? You wouldn't have that fear anymore because you'd be like, I'm going to do it. Doesn't really matter because I'm going to do it, right? And so I think, just really appreciating life, pushing through and really, as they say, seize the day. Like really, there's 24 hours in a day. You're sleeping like maybe 6 to 8 of them. Use the rest of those hours productively.
That's great. Well, thank you for joining us today.
Thank you for having me. I appreciate it. Congratulations to you on the show, and definitely, thanks for having me. And if folks want to learn more about the work that we do, they can check us out online, bksjf.org. Or if they want to learn more about me, you can check my website out, greggbishop.nyc.
Awesome. Thank you.
I hope you enjoyed this episode. If you did and believe on the mission we're on, please like, rate, and subscribe to this podcast on whatever platform you're using, and share this podcast with your friends in your networks. Make sure you follow us on Instagram and LinkedIn at Career Cheat Code, and tell us people or careers you would like to see highlighted. See you next week with some more cheat codes. Peace.